Alright, so like with last month's video, even though I did technically play multiple games this month for the sake of what I think would fit well on this channel, I'm just going to talk about one of them, which is the big one I played last month, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth isn't a bad game per se, but it is a disappointment in the sense that where Remake miraculously managed to justify stretching out a 5-hour intro sequence into a full 30-hour game, Rebirth left me feeling like they should have just stuck to making one game after all. The amount of padding in Rebirth is absurd. I did all of the side quests in Remake, and initially had planned to do the same in Rebirth, alongside all of the Queen's Blood matches. But a couple chapters in, I gave up because I was just not having fun. I don't normally hold bad optional content against a game precisely because it is optional, but in Rebirth's case, I think it's justified because they're constantly shoving it in your face during the early game. Besides, the annoying padding isn't always optional. When Rebirth isn't being bogged down by its bad side quest, it's slotting extended minigame sections in the middle of otherwise enthralling story sequences. I respect that Rebirth tries to lean into the occasional absurdity of the original game with all of the minigames and whatnot, but when that absurdity actively detracts from the seriousness of the story around it, it just starts to become annoying. None of this is aided by the fact that Rebirth is an Act 2 isolated from its Acts 1 and 3. The story does start to pick up in the back half, but between the stakes only vaguely recalled from the first game and all of the aforementioned padding drawing attention away from what plot is actively happening, the first half of the game often feels like the party is just wandering from place to place without much rhyme or reason save for the fact that it's where all of the hooded men are going. The frustrating thing about all this is that Rebirth has some sequences that are absolutely stellar. Barrett in particular absolutely steals the show in this game, which I really was not expecting. Barrett was a character I always liked, but Rebirth really elevated him with all of his fun comedic moments in the early game and his more serious emotional moments in the back half of the game. Just in general, the story really picks up around the time the party gets to the Golden Saucer. By then it finally starts to feel like the plot has some more direction, and the party starts to feel more active in all of the goings-on between Barrett's backstory and Cloud and Tifa's shared trauma. I thought the way the game portrayed Cloud's PTSD was really strong, except in Chapter 13, but we'll get to that. And Tifa's trip through the live stream was another standout moment. Rebirth's strength in adapting and augmenting scenes from the original game makes me think that if they made a single, straightforward remake of the original Final Fantasy VII, it would easily be a perfect time. Unfortunately, much as how the game started weak, it also kind of ended weak, in the sense that the last two chapters kind of lost me. I really don't like how they handled the whole sequence with the Black Material. It was such a memorable part of Cloud's character arc in the original game, because it's a futile moment of him trying and failing to escape from Sephiroth's influence. Here in Rebirth, Sephiroth seems to completely take him over from the moment the party enters the temple, and the whole back and forth with the Black Materia dilutes the strength of Cloud's apparent betrayal. Then immediately after that, at the start of Chapter 14, the game really dives into all of the timeline shenanigans hinted at the end of Remake, and it was all very confusing. First of all, I still don't know how or why Zack is alive, and if he's alive in the main timeline or some side timeline or what, which is odd, because it felt like the end of Remake was setting things up so that Rebirth would answer that question. Then there's the whole situation with Aerith's death. Going in, I thought how Rebirth chose to handle Aerith's death would serve as something of a litmus test for how seriously I should take the Remake trilogy as an earnest attempt to retell the original story going forward. Aerith's death is such a famous and well-remembered moment in gaming to this day, not just because it's sad, but because it ties so strongly into the original game's themes of life and death. If the Remake trilogy has any interest whatsoever in maintaining the integrity of that messaging, they would kill off Aerith. On the other hand, Remake made it clear that the writers didn't give a damn about what the audience thought, and that they were going to do whatever they wanted with this trilogy. So if they really wanted to drive that point home and stick it to the purists, they would let Aerith live. So what did they decide to do? Both, apparently. Even by the time the final cutscene rolls around, it's still not clear what exactly happened. Overall, I just don't understand the point of introducing things like parallel worlds and alternate timelines into Rebirth. At least in Remake it made sense since that game was actively trying to be a meta-commentary on the original, but Rebirth doesn't really take things in that direction. So as it stands, it mostly just feels like they're convoluting the plot for no reason. I maintain that Remake is still a great game in spite of Rebirth's relative failure to follow up on that game's formula. So I do have hopes that they can pull things together for the finale, but Rebirth when taken on its own reminds me a lot of Tales of Arise. Its strong middle section is held back by a weak beginning and ending that, when combined with a number of odd gameplay decisions, makes the game an extremely mixed bag. If you wanted an alternate review of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, you could also just watch the ProZD video about games with too many mechanics, and that would get the message across pretty well, I think. As always, here is the list of this year's rankings, and I will see you all next time.